Um, Russell, I was wondering the impact of the survey that your group did on anti-Asian hate, because it, it acquired a lot of data, right? And then you were able to analyze it. But what kind of social impact does that type of survey have? Because I know there's a lot of news coverage about the fact that there was a survey done. And it's ongoing. But what kind of impact does that have? And does it bring people together, or yeah?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is community knowledge that we think should be shared, that we have over 1,500 incidents of hate, and it's just a tip of the iceberg. And the way I really appreciated how at this Americans are lifting up their voices to stand up against racism. 8% were submitted in non-English languages. And I think we trust the organizations I've been working with. And so they get a lot more reports than the police would. And so, but we're not just giving a chance for people to grieve and air their grievances on a forum, but we're actually collecting it and actually saying, here are the community responses that we need for anti-bullying, for bystander intervention, for workplace discrimination, for hate crimes. What are your rights? And so we've been posting that to have targeted community responses. And we've also taken it to our state legislature and to the governor in California. So the API Legislative Caucus, Ratha was talking about using our Solidarity for Power. We've been working pretty well with the Legislative Caucus to challenge the governor to make government agencies more responsive. One of the places where we're having a lot of confrontations are in businesses and stores, because that's the only place we interact with people. But Asian Americans should have the right to safe access to goods and services, and we're not getting provided that. So we're calling on the government and for corporations to say, this is our right, and to put up signage to ensure that, and tell the managers that we should need that. So I think we use our data to come up with really specific targeted interventions, and that's how we use it. So one of the responses people can have is, if you see anti-Asian bias, to report it, and then we use that to come up with a community voice. The other opportunities I think that are arising now is that as Asian Americans are getting racially profiled and they're super sensitive and hyper aware of how people see them and see them as threats or as disease carriers, then kids can empathize with other communities of color. And I think that's my hope, like Ratha's hope, is that we would build stronger solidarities with other communities of color to challenge what's going on. COVID-19 is exposing our racial inequalities. African Americans are dying at 6 times the rate as others. In some states, it's 50 to 70% of the deaths are African American. The Latinx community is the hardest hit economically. And the Asian American community too, 1 out of 7 are undocumented. They don't have access to testing. They don't have access to stimulus checks. And so they're even more marginalized. So besides building solidarity with other communities of color, I think Asian Americans now are coming up and recognizing we have a common interest together. That people who think they're the model minority and who may be doctors, they're getting harassed at, even when they're serving patients, right? Their own patients are shunning them because they're Asian. And then again, Asians on the margins are likely to be impacted. So I think I see a real mobilization of Asian Americans at this time with a higher Asian American consciousness that is in solidarity with others. And so hopefully we'll use this as a mobilizing opportunity, because I think it's going to get worse. Just to warn you guys, as we stay sheltered in place longer, as the economy tanks, as Republicans use this as an issue and out, this is way worse than the Vincent Chin era. It could be as bad as 9/11 era for South Asians. And so we got to be prepared for not only interpersonal confrontations, but actually government policies directed against Asian Americans. And so we have to be prepared. And that's why, like Ratha and Shina said, we need that solidarity, or else one by one, Trump is picking us off.
Okay, so that would go into another question for Julie, who in her book discusses the danger, the crisis. Well, one is you talked about how they're trying to use the cover of the COVID-19 crisis to push through more deregulation, right? To loosen up on emissions and so forth. But another part in your book where you talk about the crisis is about how there's the use of anti-immigrant sentiments, nationalist, populist, authoritarianism, militarized security discourses, and racist policies are on the rise, and that these are all becoming linked internationally. So it doesn't look like a very good situation, right? Given the climate crisis, the rise of more authoritarianism, and then here we are. We're at the bottom of all this. Our communities are suffering from climate crisis, COVID-19. Is there any upside, in terms of what can be done? So first you outline it as this is taking place internationally. How can that be dealt with? Yeah.
Well, I think one of the questions that I've been really thinking about a lot is, what's the start point, or how do you, understand the era we're in? And for me, one of the start points is a lot of the organizing around free trade agreements in the 90s, NAFTA, and so on. And the fight then, I think, is similar to the fight now, which was about how corporations wanted to move products, but they wanted to not move, they didn't want people to move. And so even though and the anti-globalization and the free trade battles, like the battle for Seattle, really tried to link, from the justice lens without the internet, a global labor, a global environmental movement that said, you can't have, people in making your stuff and then not have people and ideas and power from the standpoint of justice, moving around. So in some sense, I think we're in this moment, and Trump really used the anti-China and the Making America Great Again is a lot of reaction to that corporate-led globalization. And so I think one of the things that the justice movements back then, labor and environmental, and the justice movements now are trying to do is to think about how globalization looks like if it's not corporate-led, and about making money and, enriching corporations and the elites. And so the rising economic inequality alongside with the rising carbon emissions, those things are connected. And what justice movements do really well, I think, and one of the most important things that justice movements do is to articulate this as a series of, frameworks, but also stories, where you're not talking about freedom as the freedom to buy shit. You know what I mean? Or the freedom to, like, now you see all of the people who are saying, oh, live free or die, get rid of the stay in place, orders and so on. Freedom doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want, and then corporations mean a ton of money, So I think justice movements, one of the single most important things that they offer is how they narratively or from a story framework are retelling this story of who the victims are, who the perpetrators are, and what the alternative narrative that's not the dominant one coming from Fox or the political elites is. And that, for me, that centrally is around delinking freedom and markets. And, here I want to echo what Shina and Ratha were saying is, the COVID-19 kind of blows apart, any of the perception that there wasn't enough money for whatever it is. There's not enough money for a post-carbon, reality. Look at the $2 trillion bailouts that happened right after COVID. So it just blows apart that argument. So where I have hope and this is, it's hard to have hope for me, I'll be honest, but this is an important part of the book, because the chapter that's talking about disasters and crisis and recovery also tries to talk about radical hope. And how do we have that when it feels so hopeless right now, especially from a climate change perspective? And I think the radical hope is a non-naive optimism. And then for me, the non-naive optimism is that communities don't just roll over and die because the elites don't want them to exist. Do you know what I mean? The hope is in the fight. That's the only thing that keeps me centered, or it's one of the only things. So do I have hope? Yeah, I do, but I'm not deluded about what the scale and scope of the problems or the amount of money that's being thrown at agendas that I find completely, it's like a lot of people are talking about the death cult of capitalism, and I think that, in the book I talk about that we're in at this moment where the death cult is around carbon, capitalism, and white supremacy. And so you see right now the forces of carbon, white supremacy, and capitalism, like they're losing their shit, because they know how many more people are aligned with a justice framework. So that's the hope, but it's also the danger. And that's the paradox that we're in. So.
And with that, we'll go into our audience question and answer. Let's see. So.
Okay, let me just share this out. Yes, so if you have any questions, I did see about 2 questions that came in through the chat. And while we're doing that, I would also like to share out this slide. This is just some more ways for all of you in attendance to stay in touch with us. If you are really intrigued and inspired by what you're hearing, please feel free to reach out to any of us, follow us. There were a lot of great links and information posted in the chat. We will also make that publicly available once the recordings are ready for posting.
I'll read one of the questions. Okay, this one person stated that I am a project coordinator with Asian American Women Artists Association. Thanks so much for sharing. I was wondering if any of you have worked with artists to bring awareness and encourage engagement on these issues, and what kind of creative solutions or actions have come out of these relationships to build solidarity. AAWAA AWA is likely to put on an exhibit next year related to climate and environmental justice next year. And we would love to partner with APEN as well. Is it possible to get in touch with all the panelists? Okay, okay, so I guess there's 2 parts. One is, I was wondering if any of you have worked with artists to bring awareness and encourage engagement on this issue. I think we were trying to design a logo, but and does anybody have thoughts on that? So definitely art is an important part of building a social movement.
Yeah, Shina was at Standing Rock, so she can talk about her experiences there or other, but in the chapter on Standing Rock, but also in some of the other parts that, in the book, art is a huge part of that narrative of hope. You don't have movements without people busting out incredible creativity and beauty and music. One of the people I work with in New York says, our organizing has to look like the communities we come from. It has to sound like us. It has to taste like us. It has to move and feel like us. And art is a huge part of that.
Yeah, I sort of agree. We are presented with all these scientific facts about climate change, but it doesn't move people. But what moves people are when you change their minds and their hearts. And I think that's why artists and storytellers, and actually religion, is one of the main ways that people could be moved towards environmental justice.
And there's another question here. Is there some way to make sense of the anti-Trump, pro-Biden ads, which are centered around the messages of Yellow Peril and Trump being weak on China during this pandemic? Okay.
I haven't seen those ads, so I can't speak, but Russell, in our pre-meeting, we were talking about, what is the position of, how do we not also do what Andrew Yang said, which was be more patriotic, be more American, and that's going to be the answer to the anti-Chinese rhetoric, because I don't think that's the solution either. And I think the tricky solution, the tricky place is going to be around how do you navigate this? And you could see it in the carbon case, like when China overtook the US in emissions, and then suddenly everybody was obsessed with Chinese pollution, rather than thinking about how the Chinese pollution was tied to the global framework as the world's factory, et cetera, et cetera. So how are you critical of, Chinese policy around emissions and the party and all that stuff, but not fall into the Yellow Peril rhetoric? And that's a very tricky kind of line. I haven't seen this ad, so can't speak to it, but I think that's probably another example of how do we do the critique, but then also not fall into the trap.
Yeah, I think we have to I think the ad is actually a Trump ad that says Biden is weak on China. But I think we really have to strategically now, before it becomes a campaign issue, sort of cut it off before it becomes too big of a mainstream issue. And I think, again, what Ratha and Shina were saying is that we need to emphasize international solidarity during this global pandemic, that we're all impacted, that a cough from around the world is changing all of us, continents away. And so we're super interconnected, and we need to not just fight for our individual rights to consume, like Julie says, but we need to have a sense of corporate responsibility. I think, again, that's where our Asian traditions, everybody's got to use Julie's book, as it should be a required Asian American Studies textbook, but it talks about how we have Asian resources for environmental justice. And I think we need to sort of reclaim the sense of corporate responsibility rather than pushing for individual rights of justice. And as we do that, then we would take a sort of global responsibility, both for the world and for our fellow humans, to challenge the sort of nationalistic impulse that's being driven by both nations now. But I don't know how to change that narrative. That's really hard. That's why we need artists and writers to change the narrative.
It seems like historically, whenever there was a crisis, Yellow Peril is always posed, to divert, distract. The use of the Asian enemy stereotype. I think even the last, I think during the time of Wen Ho Lee, there was a presidential election there. There's accusations of Democrats being weak on China. Before that, there was that John Wong Asian finance money scandal. Yellow Peril was raised there. So it's something that's consistent, that the Asian American community definitely has to confront and deal with. And I think as far as what the environmental justice movement is about, the internationalism, people coming together, the anti-racism part, the Yellow Peril should also be a key component of that. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so there's another question. Okay. How should we deal with the inflammation of nationalism due to the recent incidents, such as COVID-19 and the trade war? I think that was kind of similar to what we've been discussing, but does anybody have anything direct to address that? Okay, if not, then please talk about whether a wider publicizing of racial attacks would promote a greater community rejection of this behavior or invite more of this problem. Okay. I guess that would be Russell.
Oh, do you think we could go rotate the speakers?
Okay. Ratha?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think this question kind of relates to the one earlier in terms of what do we do with anti-Asian discrimination and sentiment. One, I think yes, reporting it and sharing it out is good. However, I think what we're trying to do is build a counter narrative and reframe what that is. And I believe that by making acts of solidarity and talking about solidarity and showing up, and that also means is how do we show up for other communities that have been impacted unfairly as well. So by us showing up in solidarity, we also invite that solidarity back. And I think it's really hard when those instances come up, because one, not only does that contribute to just actual physical discrimination and violence in an unhealthy environment, a hostile environment, it contributes to the psychological trauma that we've built over, that many communities have built over, that have been impacted by a lot of injustices. So of course, like, we're gonna get triggered when this situation comes about. And what we don't want to happen is to really have it really spiral out of control, where we get triggered and to the point where we start becoming hostile as well. And I think that's a really difficult thing in terms of like how violence and hostility can invite more violence and hostility. And to really counter that is to really be peaceful, to really look and branch out those acts of solidarity and to talk about it. And, you know, a good example that I had was before, I think this was probably in January, before even the lockdown happened. I was on a bus ride back and I had my skateboard, and in the front there was this white guy and this Asian lady, and this white guy started being really mean to the Asian lady. And it got to the point where at the last stop, as she was leaving, he tried to spit on her. And immediately the people, there was a black lady next to her and a white lady, and then I myself sat, like, we confronted him, and it was a whole thing. But however, out of that situation was what I saw out of it was like, yes, that was an act of discrimination. And I also saw an act of solidarity that I really feel needs to be vocalized, because I think that's the time that we're going to be in terms of how do we think about solving these complex problems in a way that we haven't before. And I think that kind of segues to one of the other questions, and before I'll pass it off to my colleague. And yeah, so I think as the corporations, like, for example, look for bailouts, I think it's time for us to not think about bailouts and start thinking about buyouts. So I know that there has been a signature gathering movement to propose to the federal government that if oil companies try to seek bailouts, how can we instead look to have a buyout of those corporations? So yeah, I know those are kind of diverging topics, but yeah, I want to give my time.
Okay, and then
add to a couple of things that Ratha just brought up and some of the other speakers. I definitely think, yeah, it's a hard place that we're in, and we're being inundated with news about crises even before this pandemic started. That's kind of just how our media system works. And so that can be really stressful. And I think without giving people, just sharing that, without giving people concrete ways to do something about it, is just really stressful, and it doesn't help the organizing. So my mind went to kind of what Russell had brought up in terms of like the threats coming from policy, or Julie was talking about kind of like green capitalism, all these false solutions that are being presented to us as ways out, and the opportunity for us to actually make sure that we're a part of decision making to get ahead of some of those things. And so I think in addition to the increased violence that our communities are facing right now, I'm thinking also to the violence of pollution and toxicity that we're being exposed to all the time, and the ways that our communities are consistently left behind in disasters. My mind kind of went to, but when preparing for this talk, was thinking about Hurricane Harvey and Typhoon Haiyan as like two big, huge storms that impacted Asian communities in different ways. So Hurricane Harvey, that hit like an area with high petrochemical use, but that's also where 1 in 5 people in those communities didn't speak a lot of English. And how do people get the information that they need to get out of situations that if they're not prepared? And that was one of APEN's flagship campaigns back in the 90s, to do a multilingual warning system with the Richmond refinery, which could see the same thing with sea level rise in terms of that kind of climate plus industrial disaster. So how do we make sure that our communities are part of that? And so last year, we even worked on a bill that was requiring community engagement and cultural competency and emergency planning. So making sure that as the state and counties develop their emergency plans, how are they consulting with our communities in language? How are they making sure that people don't feel threatened when they actually are seeking shelter, like we saw with the wildfires, of undocumented folks being too afraid to access help, or queer folks not being welcome in shelters, and just the different facets of communities that people who are currently making the decisions just are not thinking about. And so how do we kind of embed our needs and our leadership, not just in making policy, but like the implementation and the structures of how we can respond. And then I think just to respond also to Ratha's last point about kind of like the bailouts and the corporate takeover and corporate giveaways at this time, we have some opportunities this year as well. November, on the ballot, we have a chance to vote for Schools and Communities First, which is a chance to close a corporate tax loophole and get $11 billion for public education and local services that we're definitely going to need in this time. And we're also working on a California Green New Deal. And so definitely seeing that that level of mobilization with strong progressive values and a strong safety net, and taking a bold step to transition our economy away from the extractive economy that's just making everything worse in a public health crisis, deeply investing in jobs and healthcare, housing, education, immigrant justice, racial justice, in tangible ways as a really strong response, instead of kind of what we're seeing at the federal level. So I just wanted to throw that out there as two kind of state level things that are happening this year too.
We have one more final question, and this person asks, what are more specific examples of coalition building among other marginalized communities of color who are facing the same thing but come from different backgrounds? So the question is about, is solidarity taking place, is APEN involved in coalition building? Can you talk about some of that, or maybe Ratha can address it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've been a part of a lot of different coalitions. The most recent one is the Richmond Our Power Coalition. I think what we really tried to do there in terms of how do we bring folks from different walks of life together was we tried to identify activities that would be beneficial for everybody, and we tried to target you know, it's for me, it's like I would recommend for coalitions to target things that you can't do by yourself, right? So try to really figure out what are all those things that are impacting your communities, and how can you change, and how can you organize and make that change happen. So something that we did was the People's Assembly. So we basically canvass, and instead of usually canvassing with a script and getting people to ask for a signature, we canvass relationships, and we ask how they were doing, and we really got really long, paragraph long qualitative data on just what the communities have been impacting. And the impacts was housing, gentrification, but also like their safety. Folks are really concerned about their safety from the amount of police that were in the community, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But the People's Assembly was a way to help bring people from walks of life together and help mobilize around a platform. And then when we were able to create a platform, and then that kind of creates your campaign for a coalition. But definitely doing a groundwork first of getting people together, getting people grounded together, getting people to appreciate one another is like a lot of work too. There's a lot of work to foster the relationships in the coalition before the coalition goes out and do campaign work.
Okay, so so with that, we'll end our panel today. It definitely today I actually learned quite a lot, you know, from the different communities and the different struggles and everybody's lives. I didn't know Julie grew up in New York Chinatown, and and that Russell's family also had SF Chinatown background, and Shina's family had to deal with the refinery toxic releases. I knew a little bit about Ratha from his UC Berkeley days, but definitely for myself, I'm much more informed about the environmental justice issue, and I'm pretty sure that the audience has also. What may seem like a radical demand is, you know, this idea of access to healthcare. It's not a radical demand. It's a right, and access to clean and healthy environment is also a right. And I just want to thank everybody for affirming that. Okay. So what can people do? Well, people know how to get in touch with Asian Pacific Environmental Network. They know how to get in touch with Ratha, Julie, Russell, with regards to the anti-hate campaign. So definitely we need to build solidarity more than ever. Julie's emphasis that we are in a particular moment in history, and we need to act on it now. Definitely read Julie's book. Support your community institutions. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Harvey, and I wanted to echo all of the thank yous. And I know we're a little over time, so thank you so much for everyone still staying with us. I wanted to also follow up with a special announcement, which is that OACC and Eastwind Books, we're launching a Giving Tuesday Now campaign to help raise funds so that we can continue events like this for our community. So if you were inspired at all and you would like to see good work like this continue to be out there, our goal is $5,000 by May 5th. We will also post this link as well as all of the other information that was shared out in the chat. We will definitely share that out with everyone as soon as possible. And once again, thank you. Stay positive, stay connected, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you, everyone.